Chapter 33 of Your Psychic Powers and How to Develop Them. Recording by Pamela Krantz. Your Psychic Powers and How to Develop Them by Hereward Carrington. Chapter 33: Reincarnation in Eastern Philosophy. Most religious philosophies of the East are based on the reality of reincarnation, or the embodiment of the same soul in a variety of physical bodies, living on this earth at various stages of the world's history, often separated from each other by a number of years. The doctrine contends that the same individuality is maintained throughout all these lives, as a background, but that each life is also an individual experience which is destined to teach the soul one or more particular lessons, which it needed to learn for the purposes of its ultimate progression and perfection. The doctrine is based largely upon the law of compensation, which says that inasmuch as there is, in this life, so much obvious inequality as regards the material returns, rewards, and happiness, there must be another chance for that soul at another time and under other circumstances, and that the poverty and other conditions which may be present in this life are for a purpose and teach a lesson, and that quite possibly in some past life the same individual has been extraordinarily wealthy and has misused the riches and power entrusted to him. The memory of past lives. This is a fascinating doctrine, and one which, at first sight, asks us to yield our consent to it. Yet there are many objections to this theory of reincarnation, as we shall see presently. It may be well to answer here one main objection to the doctrine, which is sure to be advanced by the ordinary critic, and this is, that if the same soul be reincarnated a number of times, it should remember its past lives, while as a matter of fact it rarely does so, and if we are to profit or benefit by these in any way, one would think that this memory would be absolutely essential. The Theosophist or Reincarnationist replies to this, however, by stating that each life is intended to be an individual, separate existence, without a memory bond or connection with any previous life. The soul of the individual which reincarnates only reaps the knowledge of each life after death, when this knowledge is added to the total mass of experiences already gained. Thus the individual human life is conceived to be greater than any single life, just as a bucket of water is composed of thousands of drops, each drop being separate until merged with others into the whole. In the same way, each individual life, representing a separate drop, would be individualized until after death, when it is again merged into the total personality. Our inability to remember former lives is accounted for by assuming that there is no direct connection between the total self and the self which is built up in this life through the physical brain. They are separated, though it would take too long to explain here exactly the nature and causes of this separation, according to the doctrines advanced. The arguments for reincarnation. Another argument which is advanced in favor of the doctrine of reincarnation, and to many minds a very strong one, is that life must necessarily be eternal and immortal, inasmuch as it is indestructible by death, and continues to exist to all eternity in the future, and for the same reason it must also have existed from eternity in the past, and it is inconceivable that such a thing as an individual human spirit should continue to exist forever after the moment of birth, while it did not exist at all previous to that event. These are the main arguments which are brought forward in favor of the doctrine of reincarnation, and we may add to these one argument based upon experimental evidence. It is this: that many of those who have progressed sufficiently in their psychic development can, so they say, remember their past lives. Either fractions of them or incidents in them, or the whole life may be remembered as a consecutive series of scenes and events. Many of the leaders of Theosophy and other religious systems of this character contend that they can actually do so. The majority of spiritualists, however, are opposed to this view, and contend that reincarnation is not a fact, though it must be admitted that in the past there has been a great diversity of opinion on this subject. The French school of Spiritists, formerly headed by Allan Kardec, contends that reincarnation is a fact, and Kardec's work, The Spirit's Book, is based entirely upon teachings of spirits who claim that reincarnation is true. On the other hand, the majority of German, English, and American mediums contend that reincarnation is not true, and spirits who return through them also assert emphatically that it is not a fact. The reason of this apparent contradiction was explained in an earlier chapter. The communicators merely stated their own views and opinions. Reasons for doubting reincarnation. Now, in considering this doctrine of reincarnation, there are certain factors which we must bear in mind. 1. The average scientific inquirer begins by doubting the reality of survival at all, and contends that nothing persists after the change called death. For him it is annihilation. The first point to be proved, therefore, is that anything at all exists after death, and the phenomena of spiritualism are the only ones which prove this, as before pointed out. Until it is thoroughly established that spirit of any character continues to exist after death, it is useless to argue whether or not such a spirit is reincarnated, for the reason that the average skeptic would contend that there is no such thing as a spirit to reincarnate. Until this primary fact of spirit existence is proved, therefore, it is useless to argue concerning this question of reincarnation. 2. Assuming that this is granted, still there is no proof that reincarnation is a fact, if we demand proof in the scientific sense of the word. In order to establish such a doctrine as this, a tremendous mass of testimony would be necessary, far more than the ordinary phenomena of spiritualism, which claim to establish a comparatively simple truth. Yet, as a matter of fact, there is far less evidence, as we all know, for the reality of reincarnation than there is for spirit return. As the strength of the evidence should be proportioned to the strangeness of the facts, it will be seen that we are as yet very far from proving reincarnation according to this standard. A vast mass of well-attested evidence would have to be forthcoming, and this has not been produced. 3. It is not necessarily true that because the human spirit continues to exist for all eternity in the future, it must necessarily have existed from all eternity in the past. Physics teaches us that a body set in motion comes to rest because of the hindrance or friction from outside forces acting upon it. If there be no friction to retard such a body, it would theoretically go on forever in a straight line. Once give a ball an initial push, and provided there is no friction, it would roll on forever without coming to a stop. It might well be, therefore, that the human spirit, once initiated, would continue in the same fashion, since we can see no hindrances to its progress resembling those acting in our physical world. Again, a speck of mud thrown off from a revolving wheel only exists as an individual speck, after it was thrown off in this manner. Before, it was a part of the general mass. Assuming, therefore, that an individual human spirit is in some way separated and individualized at birth from the general stock of cosmic life energy, at the moment of conception it might be that it continued as an individual thing thereafter for all eternity, without necessarily having existed as such in the past. The spiral or vortex of life. In the next place, assuming that life is an individualized force, we can quite conceive that this force, ascending in a series of spirals, tends to become more detached and individualized with each revolution through which it passes, and that ultimately it will tend to become detached and thrown off, as it were, from the vortex of life as an individual being. Birth might represent this process, and again we see that it is not necessary to suppose that human spirit must have existed in the past because it continues to exist in the future. As to the law of compensation already mentioned, this is not really an argument but rather an emotional belief based upon the idea of justice. But in the first place this may not necessarily be true, and in the second, even supposing that it is, the same result is reached in other religions, for according to the teachings of orthodox Christianity, the reward of the poor but righteous is in heaven, and according to spiritualistic philosophy it depends on individual progress and effort. How we remember past lives. The doctrine of reincarnation cannot, therefore, be said to present a logical justification for the belief. There remains the more substantial foundation, based upon the before mentioned experimental proof, namely, that many persons claim that they can remember portions of their past lives, and even that they can remember the whole of them. These latter cases, however, are very rare, and the material from which one could form one's judgment regarding such cases has never been published. Owing to the lack of respectable evidence in this direction, therefore, we may assume for the present, and until proof to the contrary be forthcoming, that such cases depend not upon reality, but upon elaborate subconscious imaginations and romances which these individuals have constructed within themselves, as the result of brooding and thinking over possible past lives of their own. There are many analogies for this belief, and in some cases, at least, it has been proved beyond all question of doubt that these past lives were in reality fictitious, and that the memory of them, so called, was certainly and purely subconscious imagination. Those who may be interested in obtaining this proof are referred to Professor Flournoy's book, From India to the Planet Mars. Where and how these memories originate. There remains those cases, far less satisfactory and convincing, but far more numerous, in which isolated incidents of past lives have been remembered, or in which scenes have flashed up before the mind, together with the impression, amounting to a certainty, that the individual has experienced or lived through that scene before. Most cases of this character may be explained in a perfectly natural manner, and do not afford any direct proof of the doctrine of reincarnation. Let me explain a few of the causes which may be operating inducing such apparent memories of past lives. In the first place, many of them are due to so-called illusions or hallucinations of memory, so-called pseudo-presentiments, in which the event and the feeling that it has transpired become reversed or transposed in the mind, so that one remembers the impression as occurring before the real event, while in reality it happened afterward. That this occurs in many cases has been scientifically proved. In the second place, dreams or subconsciously noted impressions which never come into consciousness may suddenly flash up in connection with a certain mental event, and this would give rise to a feeling, true in a sense, that we had experienced it before. We had, but in a dream and not in a previous life. Thirdly, many experiences, conversations, etc., overseen or overheard before the age of 4, when the personality is in the process of formation, and when consecutive memory and consciousness of self is said to begin, may be remembered as isolated experiences, and these may also give rise to the impression that we had seen them or experienced them before. Again, this is a fact, but it was not in a previous life. Lastly, there are many cases in which the subconscious mind noted a scene or event a fraction of second, or perhaps several seconds, or even minutes, before the conscious mind did, and when the latter became aware of it, there would again be this sense of familiarity, and the feeling that we had seen or experienced this event before. This is true, but it was only a short time before the actual experience. For all these reasons, therefore, and others which it would take too long to give, the majority of spiritualists and psychical researchers do not at present regard the doctrine of reincarnation as true, or in any way adequately proved, and prefer to believe, until this proof be forthcoming, that the individual human spirit is initiated at birth, builds up its own life by its own efforts and experiences, and that it continues to improve upon this life by continuous striving, after it has reached the spiritual world, in the same manner that it does here on earth. CHAPTER XXXIV Reincarnation and Eastern Philosophy. Pamela Krantz